Not every Ford creation made it to the dealership. Some were built in secrecy, tested in controlled environments, and then shut down before the public ever got a glimpse. These weren't just concepts. They were real, running vehicles that were banned from production due to legal, safety, emissions, or strategic reasons. Some were too powerful, others too risky, and a few were simply too ahead of their time. Here are 8 banned cars that Ford built but never released, and why you've never seen them on the road.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 8. In the mid-1980s, the world of rally racing was dominated by Group B, a class with almost no rules, barely any restrictions on technology, and a reputation for being violently fast. Out of this chaos came one of the most infamous creations, the 1984 Ford RS200. It was a car that existed purely because regulations required street-legal versions of racing machines, but it was so potent and wild that it, along with the rest of Group B, was banned from competition and deemed too dangerous for regular roads. Ford had failed to compete effectively in rallying with its Escort and Capri models by the early 1980s. To conquer the new Group B scene, Ford needed to design a car from scratch. The RS200 wasn't derived from any existing Ford road model. It was a purpose-built race car disguised as a production vehicle to meet the homologation rule that required 200 street versions to be made. Rather than slap rally gear on a road car, Ford engineered the RS200 with performance first. The result? An AWD mid-engine monster with cutting-edge suspension and a futuristic design that could barely pass for a street car. The RS200 featured a mid-mounted 1.8-liter turbocharged Cosworth BDT engine, pushing up to 450-plus horsepower in rally trim. The street version was detuned to around 250 HP, but that was still a rocket in a car that weighed just over 2,300 pounds. The RS200 used a unique AWD system that distributed power through a center differential to maximize traction on all surfaces. This made it a terror on dirt, snow, and gravel alike. Designed with rally punishment in mind, the double wishbone suspension gave the RS200 the agility of a rallycross car combined with track car sharpness. Design. The RS200's fiberglass body was styled by Ghia and constructed by Reliant. Yes, the same company behind the infamous three-wheeled Robin. It featured huge scoops, flared fenders, and a stubby body, a functional form that screamed speed. To satisfy the FIA, Ford produced 200 units of the RS200 in road-going form, called the RS200 Evolution. Despite being technically street legal, driving one on public roads was like strapping a jet engine to a go-kart. It was loud, uncomfortable, Spartan, and required constant attention. There were no luxury features, only raw power. Functional and basic, lightweight materials, racing seats, and minimal instrumentation. Forget air conditioning or plush trim. This was a missile with license plates. Performance, road version. 0 to 60 miles per second in around 5 seconds, quicker in Evo trim. Top speed, 140 to 150 miles per second. Brutal turbo lag, followed by a vicious power surge. In the heat of rally competition, the RS200 was brilliant, but it came too late to dominate. Despite some promising performances in 1986, it was overshadowed by the Lancia Delta S4 and Peugeot 25T16. But the real end came not from performance, but tragedy. A series of fatal accidents, most notably one involving an RS200 that killed 3 spectators, highlighted how uncontrollable and unsafe these cars were. With over 500 horsepower and nearly no driver aids, they were too much for even seasoned professionals. In 1986, Group B was banned altogether, and the RS200, along with other Group B legends, was retired from competition. After the ban, Ford shelved the RS200 project entirely. Many of the road-legal cars ended up in private collections. Some were upgraded to even more insane specifications. RS200 Evolutions were tuned to produce up to 600-plus horsepower and used in rallycross or hill climb events. Despite its short lifespan, the RS200 became a legend. Collectors prize it today for its rarity, only 200 made. Performance enthusiasts admire its pure, unfiltered engineering. Pop culture appearances in video games like Gran Turismo, Dirt, and Forza have kept its memory alive. The 1984 Ford RS200 wasn't just a rally car, it was a warning. It showed what happened when engineers were told to ignore limits, and drivers were left to tame machines more powerful than they could safely handle. It was banned for good reason, but its legacy endures. Built for dominance, feared on the track, and revered in history, the RS200 is one of the ultimate examples of what happens when ambition meets adrenaline and crosses the line.
Number 7. In the mid-1960s, Ford wasn't just building cars, it was waging a war. A corporate vendetta against Ferrari for backing out of a buyout deal led to the birth of the GT40, a purpose-built endurance racing car that would go on to dominate Le Mans. But buried in the legend of race wins and roaring V8s lies a forgotten chapter: the rare, barely road-legal GT40 MK1 street version. This was Ford's attempt to bring its racing fury to the public. But while the street GT40 was real, it was never a mass-market machine. It was too raw, too expensive, and ultimately too dangerous and impractical to exist as a street-legal production car. After being publicly snubbed by Ferrari in 1963, Henry Ford II launched Project GT40 with the goal of beating Ferrari at its own game, endurance racing. The result was the GT40 MK1, mid-engined, lightweight, with a steel monocoque chassis and Ford's V8 Thunder under the hood. The MK1 made its competition debut in 1964, and after development refinements, by 1966, the GT40 was a Le Mans winning monster. To qualify for certain racing homologation standards and to satisfy some wealthy enthusiasts, Ford, along with British race firm Ford Advanced Vehicles, or FAV, built a handful of GT40 MK road versions, also called GT40 MK1 street cars or GT40 P/1000 series chassis. Only about 30 to 31 road-legal GT40 MK1 models were ever made, and they were not toned-down versions. These cars retained the brutalist performance of the racers: low to the ground, barely 40 inches tall, loud, stiff, and barely civilized. They had some concessions to road use: real leather seats, sound deadening, barely, basic carpeting, street-legal lights, wipers, and bumpers. But make no mistake, driving a street GT40 was like strapping into a guided missile on wheels. The GT40 MK1 street version typically used a 289 cubic inch, 4.7-liter, small block V8 with up to 380 horsepower, far beyond what most American sports cars offered at the time. Paired with a ZF 5-speed manual gearbox and weighing around 2,400 pounds, it could hit 0 to 60 miles an hour in under 5 seconds and top out well above 170 miles an hour. That kind of power in a 1960s road car was unthinkable, but that also made it deeply impractical. It had terrible visibility. The interior was cramped and oven-hot. No trunk space whatsoever. Impossible to park or drive on rough roads, and getting in and out required contortions thanks to roof-cut gullwing doors. While technically street legal in some US and European jurisdictions, the GT40 MK1 quickly ran into new federal safety and emissions regulations. The government didn't want barely modified race cars on public roads, and insurance companies agreed. In an era increasingly worried about emissions and crash protection, the GT40 became a regulatory nightmare.
Result: Ford quietly canceled plans for wider road use, leaving just a few examples for collectors, racing royalty, and company executives. Today, the Street GT40 Mk1 is a unicorn. Surviving examples fetch millions at auctions, and countless replicas exist to mimic the car's legendary looks. The GT40 name would live on in spirit with the 2005 Ford GT and the 2017 Ford GT supercars, both inspired by the Le Mans icon, but designed from the ground up to be street-legal and livable. The 1965 Ford GT40 Mk1 street version was not practical, and it wasn't really meant to be. It was a symbol of unfiltered power, a race car barely restrained for the road. It never reached mass production not because it failed, but because it was too extreme for a world that was starting to worry more about smog, safety, and insurance than outright speed.
Number 6. In the mid-1980s, Ford Europe was determined to reclaim its dominance in touring car racing. To do that, it needed a homologation special, something fast, fierce, and focused. The result was the 1985 Ford RS500 Sierra Cosworth, an evolution of the already potent Sierra RS Cosworth. Though street legal in some markets, it was banned or restricted in others due to aggressive tuning, high emissions, and excessive noise. This car was never designed for comfort. It was designed to win. By 1985, Ford Motorsports Eye was on Group A racing, a category that required at least 5,000 production units of a vehicle, with 500 more allowed for performance modifications. The base Sierra RS Cosworth launched in 1986, but it wasn't quite enough to beat the rising threat of BMW's M3. Enter the RS500, a homologation special with the explicit purpose of obliterating competitors on the track. It featured 500 units built in collaboration with Aston Martin Tickford and was stuffed with upgrades under the skin. At a glance, the RS500 resembled the standard Sierra RS Cosworth, but everything important was hidden beneath the surface. Engine: a heavily modified 2.0-liter DOHC Cosworth YBD turbocharged engine with reinforced block, larger turbo, better fuel injection, upgraded cooling, and a revised intercooler. While street versions were limited to 224 horsepower, race trim engines pushed over 500 horsepower. Aerodynamics: a larger rear wing, front splitter, and improved body rigidity made it more stable at speed, subtle but effective. Chassis and suspension: tuned for track performance, stiff, raw, and unforgiving, far from ideal for road comfort. Despite its limited production run of only 500 units, the RS500 was sold for road use, at least in the UK. But in many other countries, it was banned or blocked due to emissions non-compliance, particularly with stricter 1980s catalytic converter regulations in countries like the US, Germany, and Switzerland. Too loud: the RS500's aggressive exhaust note and minimal sound insulation exceeded legal noise limits in several regions. Deemed unsafe: with little in the way of driver aids and razor-sharp tuning, it wasn't the kind of car governments wanted in civilian hands. Even in the UK, the RS500 was considered a hardcore enthusiast vehicle, often garage-kept or used only on weekends. On the racetrack, the RS500 was a monster. It dominated the British Touring Car Championship, BTCC, especially under drivers like Andy Rouse. It saw major success in Australia, Germany, and Japan, becoming the car to beat until Group A's eventual demise. Ironically, its very success helped ensure its road version remained rare and controversial. The car had become too race-focused to masquerade as a daily driver. Today, the RS500 is a collector's holy grail. Surviving models trade for astronomical prices, especially those with full documentation and low mileage. It stands as a testament to an era when carmakers built machines with barely restrained racing DNA.
But it also symbolizes the limits of what a road car could be. One that was too loud, too raw, too dirty, and ultimately too dangerous for everyday life. Conclusion. The 1985 Ford RS500 Sierra Cosworth was not a car for the masses. It was a tool, finely honed for victory, and never concerned with luxury or compromise. While banned in many countries, it's remembered as one of the fiercest Group A homologation cars ever made, a machine that pushed performance to the edge and legality just beyond it.
Number 5. In the golden era of American muscle, Ford's Boss 429 engine was a legend in its own right. Massive, powerful, and tailor-made for NASCAR. But while the Mustang Boss 429 was the poster child of that power plant, there was a lesser-known and far more elusive candidate that nearly received the same heart: the 1970 Mercury Cougar Eliminator Boss 429. This prototype, almost mythical in rarity, represents a wild what-if scenario in Detroit muscle history. It was built with serious intent but never made it to production. The reasons? Cost, emissions, insurance, and internal politics. All the usual suspects that killed off muscle car dreams in the early 1970s. The Mercury Cougar was initially conceived as a more luxurious Mustang, a gentleman's muscle car. By 1969 and 1970, however, Mercury wanted to compete head-to-head with the street racing scene, so they introduced the high-performance Cougar Eliminator trim. This package included bold stripes, spoilers, and powerful engine options like the 428 Cobra Jet and 351 Cleveland. But there was still a void. Mercury wanted to push the envelope further by dropping in the legendary Boss 429. Ford developed the Boss 429, also known as the Blue Crescent engine, specifically for NASCAR homologation. It was a massive 429 cubic inch 7.0 V8 with hemispherical combustion chambers and a forged steel crankshaft, essentially a race engine disguised as street-legal power. Installed in a Mustang, the Boss 429 required extensive modification of the engine bay, so much so that Ford contracted Carcraft to perform the conversions. The engine was underrated at 375 horsepower, but its true output was easily over 500 horsepower in race trim. Now imagine putting that into a Cougar. One or two prototypes of the 1970 Cougar Eliminator Boss 429 were rumored to have been built, with at least one verified example surviving today. It wore all the aggressive Eliminator visuals: bright grabber paint, hood scoop, front air dam, rear spoiler, and blackout trim. But under the hood lurked something far more intimidating than its Mustang siblings: an attempt to bring ultra-high performance into Mercury's more refined image. The car was built by Ford as an experiment, perhaps to rival the growing Mopar threat from the Dodge Charger RT and Plymouth GTX. Despite the clear muscle and engineering capability, this car never hit showrooms. Here's why. Cost. The Boss 429 conversion was expensive even in a Mustang. Translating it into the Cougar's larger, heavier body meant more cost, more modifications, and even fewer units expected to sell. Insurance nightmares. By 1970, insurance premiums for muscle cars had skyrocketed. A 429-pounded Cougar would have been prohibitively expensive for the youth market Mercury was starting to attract. Emissions and fuel economy concerns. The early 1970s were the beginning of the end for big block engines. New emissions regulations and the looming oil crisis made engines like the Boss 429 seem out of step with the future. Today, the Boss 429 Cougar Eliminator exists mostly as a tantalizing footnote in muscle car lore. The known prototype is a showpiece, representing not only what Mercury could have been in the performance world, but also how the muscle car craze was choked off just as it reached its peak. In many ways, it's the muscle car equivalent of a canceled moon mission, fully prepared, beautifully designed, but never launched.
The 1970 Ford Cougar Eliminator Boss 429 prototype was a bold, unapologetic answer to the question, what if Mercury went all in on muscle? It would have been one of the fastest, rarest, and most extreme Cougars ever made. Instead, it became a symbol of lost potential and the shifting tides of the American auto industry. Its rarity makes it legendary. Its unrealized potential makes it unforgettable. Number 4. The early 1980s were a confusing time for American automakers. Still reeling from the fuel crises of the 1970s and boxed in by tightening emissions and safety regulations, car companies scrambled to build smaller, sportier, more efficient vehicles that could still offer fun behind the wheel. Into this mix came the 1982 Ford EXP Turbo prototype, a concept that seemed to promise the best of both worlds: sporty performance in a compact, affordable American coupe. But despite initial enthusiasm, the EXP Turbo never made it to production. Let's explore why. Ford launched the original EXP, short for Experimental Personal Vehicle, in 1982 as a sportier, two-seat derivative of the Ford Escort. It was meant to be a low-cost American take on the European hot hatchback, sleek, affordable, and fun to drive. But the base EXP, with its underwhelming 1.6-liter engine producing around 70 horsepower, failed to excite. It looked like a sports car, but drove like an economy hatchback. That gap between looks and performance led Ford's engineers to experiment with turbocharging. By mid-1982, a prototype EXP was outfitted with a turbocharged version of its inline-4 engine. The goal? Transform the mild-mannered commuter into a zippy, responsive two-seater. Sources suggest it used a turbocharged version of the Escort GT's engine, aiming for somewhere in the ballpark of 110 to 120 horsepower. Modest by today's standards, but a serious bump in power for a 2,300-pound car in 1982. Ford's internal tests reportedly showed promising acceleration and significantly improved highway performance. It had sporty potential on paper, maybe enough to be a poor man's Mustang SVO. Despite the promise, several major issues doomed the EXP Turbo. The biggest roadblock was regulatory. Turbocharged engines were notoriously difficult to tune for emissions in the early 80s. Ford's emission systems couldn't reliably handle the increased output without running afoul of federal standards. California, the largest car market in the U.S., had especially tough emissions laws. Certifying a niche turbo EXP would have cost Ford more than it was worth. The EXP used a front-wheel drive layout with a light rear end. Add turbo torque, and you got torque steer and unpredictable handling, especially in wet or icy conditions. Ford engineers worried that without a major chassis rework, read expensive, the car might be unstable under hard acceleration or spirited driving. The American market wasn't quite ready for a small, turbocharged two-seater with odd proportions and Escort DNA. Insurance premiums for sporty cars were skyrocketing, and a turbo EXP would likely have been seen as too expensive or too niche to sell in volume. Ford feared it might compete with, or worse, cannibalize the upcoming Mustang SVO, which was also turbocharged and more performance-oriented. By late 1982, the EXP Turbo project was shelved. A handful of prototypes may have been built and tested, but the car never saw production. Instead, Ford eventually gave the EXP a fuel-injected 1.6-liter in 1983 and a slightly more powerful 1.9-liter in 1984, but it still never lived up to its sporty looks. The 1982 Ford EXP Turbo prototype is now little more than a footnote in Ford history, a victim of its time. It represented the company's tentative steps toward downsized performance, but ultimately it was too compromised to justify the cost. Ironically, turbocharged four-cylinder cars would eventually become the norm decades later. But for the EXP, the timing wasn't right, the technology wasn't ready, and the demand just wasn't strong enough. The 1982 Ford EXP Turbo was an ambitious but flawed prototype. It symbolized the growing pains of the early 80s, an era where car makers wanted to push performance boundaries but were held back by legislation, technology, and economics. In many ways, it was a car ahead of its time, but also one that never stood a real chance. Number 3. The 1973 Ford Falcon XBGT is a legendary muscle car, not in the streets of Detroit, but on the back roads and highways of Australia. As an icon of raw power and cinematic fame, thanks to Mad Max, it was everything a gearhead loved in the early 70s: muscular styling, thundering V8s, and brutal simplicity. But despite its American Ford roots and high performance, this beast never made it to U.S. showrooms. Why? Emissions restrictions, safety laws, and insurance barriers made sure of that. The Ford Falcon started life in the U.S. in 1960 as a compact economy car. But by the late 60s, the Australian branch of Ford had transformed it into something very different. The Australian Falcon adapted to rough terrain, gained tougher construction, and eventually evolved into a powerful muscle machine. By the time the XB series launched in 1973, it had shed its economy roots and morphed into a true muscle car, one that could rival Mustangs and Chargers in raw performance. The XB Falcon featured a more aggressive front end than its predecessors, with a long hood, quad headlights, and a wide stance that screamed performance. The GT variant was the Halo version, boasting 351 Cleveland V8, a big American-made engine rated at up to 300 horsepower, 4-speed top-loader manual transmission or 3-speed automatic, limited slip differential, disc brakes, sport-tuned suspension, loud dual exhausts. Inside, it had optional luxury features, but the car was still rugged and built for performance. It wasn't a pampered boulevard cruiser, it was a serious road car for people who love to drive hard. Even though the 351 Cleveland was an American engine and the car had muscle car roots, several key factors prevented the XBGT from reaching U.S. shores. The XBGT's carbureted 351 didn't meet tightening U.S. EPA emission standards introduced in the early 1970s. The cost of certifying the car for U.S. emissions would have been enormous. American safety rules required features like 5-mile-per-hour bumpers, specific lighting, and crash standards. The XBGT lacked these. Retrofitting it would have altered its design and performance. By the mid-70s, American insurance companies were punishing high-horsepower cars with extreme premiums. Ford knew that selling a 300-plus horsepower car without airbags or catalytic converters would make it financially unviable for most buyers. Ford already had the Mustang, Torino, and other models serving the muscle car crowd. There was no incentive to import an Australian-built coupe that would cannibalize sales and need retooling. Though denied entry into America, the XB Falcon GT became a legend, and not just on the streets. It was immortalized by Mad Max, where the blacked-out Pursuit Special, based on a modified XB GT, became one of the most iconic movie cars ever. Even today, enthusiasts in the U.S. import these cars as gray market vehicles. Because of their rarity, power, and cinematic pedigree, XBGTs can command high prices at auctions and collector meets. The 1973 Ford Falcon XBGT was, in many ways, what American muscle car fans wanted but couldn't have. It embodied the V8 brute force spirit of the 1960s, just as America was strangling that power with emissions controls and insurance crackdowns. The XBGT thrived in the more lenient Australian market, earning its place as one of the last true muscle cars before the global performance slump of the late 70s.
Its story is one of what-ifs, cinematic glory, and forbidden horsepower, a roaring reminder of how different regulations shaped the muscle car scene across the world.
Number 2. In the early 1970s, the Ford Capri RS 2600 emerged as one of the finest examples of European performance engineering under the Ford banner. Designed in Europe by Ford of Germany and Ford of Britain, the Capri line was meant to be the European Mustang, compact, sleek, and sporty. But the RS 2600 wasn't just a fastback coupe with good looks. It was a homologation special for touring car racing, built with one purpose: to dominate. And it did. The only problem? Americans never got to enjoy its full fury, not because it lacked power, but because it violated too many U.S. regulations. The RS 2600 was born out of Ford's desire to win in the European Touring Car Championship. To compete under Group 2 rules, Ford had to produce a street version of the race car. Thus, the RS 2600 was created as a homologation model in 1970 based on the standard Capri, but thoroughly transformed under the hood and body. At the heart of this transformation was a specially developed 2.6-liter Cologne V6 engine fitted with Bosch mechanical fuel injection, a rarity for production cars at the time. It produced around 150 horsepower in street form and could rev high and pull hard, giving the RS 2600 a power-to-weight ratio that could embarrass larger American V8s on a twisty track. Performance and engineering. This was no ordinary Capri. The RS 2600 received a lightweight fiberglass hood and aluminum doors to shed pounds, a close-ratio 4-speed manual transmission, upgraded suspension with stiffer springs and improved geometry for high-speed cornering, 4-wheel disc brakes, later models, rare in its class, a curb weight of just over 2,300 pounds, 1,050 kilograms. It could sprint from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 7.5 seconds, a solid figure for the era, especially for a 6-cylinder. It also handled with a finesse that few American muscle cars of the day could match. A missed opportunity in the U.S. market. Despite its performance credentials and potential appeal, the RS 2600 was never sold in the United States. Several factors prevented its American debut. Emission standards. The Bosch fuel-injected V6 couldn't meet the stringent emissions regulations imposed by the EPA in the early 1970s, especially with the growing concern around smog and pollutants in major cities. Crash safety regulations. U.S. laws demanded reinforced bumpers and other structural modifications, which would have required a complete redesign of the car. Ford didn't see the return on investment to re-engineer the Capri RS 2600 for the U.S. Market strategy. Ford already sold the less potent versions of the Capri in the U.S. through Mercury dealerships, badged simply as the Mercury Capri. These were mostly equipped with 4-cylinder or small V6 engines and targeted buyers looking for economy, not speed. Internal competition. Ford was already offering the Mustang and preparing other performance models for the U.S. market. The RS 2600 might have stolen sales or muddied the brand's image, especially as it was a European import. The RS 2600's true fame came on the track. It dominated the ETCC in 1971 and 1972, becoming the car to beat. With drivers like Jochen Mass and Dieter Glemser behind the wheel, the RS 2600 was nearly unbeatable. It paved the way for the even more potent RS 3100 and helped cement Ford's motorsport legacy in Europe. Today, the RS 2600 is a prized classic in Europe. It represents a rare moment when Ford allowed its European engineers to build something pure, a lightweight racer disguised as a street car. Collectors value it for its scarcity, performance pedigree, and historical importance. In the U.S., however, it remains a forbidden fruit.
A few examples have been imported under the 25-year exemption rule, but they're exceedingly rare and expensive. The 1971 Ford Capri RS 2600 was proof that you didn't need 8 cylinders to build a muscle car. With its razor-sharp handling, lightweight construction, and racing DNA, it could run circles around many American performance cars of the era. But due to U.S. red tape, safety laws, and emission standards, it was never sold stateside in its full glory. A true example of what Americans were denied, not for lack of power, but because of the system.
Number 1. By the late 1980s, the global car industry was buzzing with excitement around rally-bred technology. Turbocharged engines, all-wheel drive systems, and aerodynamic hatchbacks were hot commodities. Ford, not wanting to be left behind, considered transforming its sporty yet soft probe into a turbocharged AWD road and rally weapon. The result was the 1989 Ford Probe GT AWD Turbo prototype, a car that promised Mitsubishi Evolution-style punch but never saw the light of day. Ford had launched the front-wheel drive Probe in 1988 as a sporty coupe alternative to the aging Mustang, co-developed with Mazda. While the production GT had a 2.2-liter turbocharged engine borrowed from Mazda's stable, it was strictly FWD and more of a boulevard cruiser than a real performance machine. But deep inside Ford's Skunk Works, engineers were playing with something more serious: a prototype Probe with AWD and a beefed-up turbo engine, aimed at the booming rally scene and high-performance imports. A turbocharged 2.2-liter or 2.3-liter engine tuned for significantly more power than the stock GT. A rally-spec AWD system, likely derived from Mazda's 323 GTX drivetrain. Modified suspension and reinforced chassis bracing. Rally-ready tweaks like upgraded cooling, wider fenders, and possibly a stripped interior for homologation potential. It was Ford's attempt to jump into the turbo AW arms race of the late 80s, chasing legends like the Audi Quattro, Toyota Celica All-Track, and Mitsubishi Galant VR4. The plan was to create a street-legal homologation special that could allow Ford to enter Group A rally or other international motorsports. The Probe GT AWD Turbo would serve as a halo car to show that Ford could play in the same league as the Japanese and Europeans. It was also part of a broader Ford strategy to infuse performance into its lineup again, a counterpoint to the dominance of Mustang V8s. Despite the bold idea, the AWD Probe GT Turbo never went beyond the prototype stage. The reasons were many. Cost. The AWD system was expensive to adapt and would have pushed the Probe's price out of its segment. Complexity. The car was based on the Mazda GD platform, and adding AWD without Mazda's full cooperation proved challenging. Emissions and reliability. The Turbo AWD combo introduced engineering and emissions hurdles that weren't cost-effective to resolve. Internal politics. With the Mustang still alive and receiving SVT attention, Ford didn't want the Probe to cannibalize or confuse the performance image. Market hesitancy. Ford doubted American buyers were ready to pay rally car money for a turbo Probe when most just wanted GT styling and decent speed. The Probe GT AWD Turbo became another what could have been in Ford's experimental history. It was built, tested, and documented internally, but eventually shelved. Few photos exist, and the car likely never left Ford's engineering garage. In Europe, Ford's RS models like the Escort Cosworth picked up the rally performance torch. In the US, Ford would later revisit the AWD turbo formula with the Focus RS decades later. The 1989 Ford Probe GT AWD turbo prototype was one of the boldest, most forward-thinking projects Ford explored in the late 1980s. It could have changed the brand's US performance trajectory and rivaled imports in a new arena. But cost, complexity, and timing buried it.
Today, it stands as a fascinating piece of lost performance history, a turbo-trouncing dream that was too ambitious for its time.